A billionaire enters a contract marriage for convenience, but is thrown off course when he discovers his bride is a virgin. What starts as a business deal soon unravels into a love story that neither of them saw coming. The grandeur of Damian Kingston's life wasn't just in his wealth, it was in his commanding presence. Damian, the enigmatic millionaire, didn't just walk into a room, he owned it. At 35, he was at the pinnacle of his career, with a luxury real estate empire spanning continents. But behind the tailored suits, the roaring engines of his collection of vintage cars, and the opulent parties that graced tabloids lay a man tired of transactional relationships. Damian was a man haunted by betrayal and too many gold diggers, each one leaving him more cynical than the last. For months, his lawyers had pressed him about finalizing his late father's estate. A stipulation in his father's will required Damian to marry before the inheritance could be fully transferred to him. It wasn't about the money. Damian already had more than he could ever spend. But the family business, their legacy, was tied to it. His father had built Kingston Estates from scratch, and Damian was determined to protect it. Enter Emily Dawson. 25 years old, her life was the antithesis of Damian's. Raised in a modest neighborhood, Emily was the epitome of resilience. She worked tirelessly as a librarian by day and volunteered at a community center by night. Despite her unassuming demeanor, Emily's quiet strength shone through her kind smile and intelligent eyes. She had dreams of starting her own literacy program for underprivileged kids, but her financial situation barely allowed her to scrape by. Emily's life took a sudden turn when her brother, Kyle, became involved with the wrong people. In a desperate attempt to pay off Kyle's debts and protect her family, Emily found herself agreeing to meet with Damian, a man she only knew through headlines and his intimidating reputation. Their meeting was anything but ordinary. Damian's assistant had meticulously arranged the encounter in a private lounge of an upscale hotel. Emily walked in, her thrift store dress a stark contrast to the shimmering chandeliers and polished marble floors. Yet, she held her head high, her determination outweighing her nerves. Damian, seated in a leather armchair, observed her with a critical eye. She wasn't what he expected. There was no pretense in her demeanor, no trace of the opportunism he'd grown to loathe. Her straightforwardness intrigued him. "Miss Dawson," Damian began, his deep voice commanding attention. "I'll get straight to the point. I need a wife, temporarily." Emily blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Temporarily?" she echoed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Yes," Damian continued. "A marriage in name only. It's a business arrangement. In exchange, I'll ensure your brother's debts are cleared, and you'll receive a substantial sum of money." Emily's mind reeled. She had expected a business proposal of some sort, but not this. Yet, as Damian laid out the terms, 3 years of marriage, no physical intimacy, and complete discretion, she realized it wasn't entirely unreasonable. For her, this wasn't about money. It was about saving her family. But Damian noticed her hesitation. "You'd be doing this for your brother," he pressed, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Think about it. A contract marriage. Nothing more." Emily swallowed hard, weighing the enormity of what she was about to agree to. "And after 3 years?" she asked. "We go our separate ways," Damian replied. "You'll be financially independent and I'll have fulfilled my obligation. Everyone wins." Emily nodded slowly. It wasn't the life she envisioned for herself, but it was a lifeline in a desperate situation. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do it." Damian's lips curved into a slight smile, not one of joy, but of satisfaction. "Good. My lawyer will draft the contract." The deal was sealed with a handshake, though the weight of their agreement hung heavily in the air. Neither of them could foresee how much their lives would intertwine, or how this purely transactional relationship would evolve into something neither had anticipated. As Emily left the hotel, she felt the magnitude of her decision settle over her. She had entered into an agreement with one of the most powerful men in the city, stepping into a world completely foreign to her. But she reminded herself why she had done it. For Kyle, for her family. For Damian, it was just another deal, or so he thought. But as he watched Emily walk away, her resolve unwavering despite her modest appearance, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within him. Curiosity, perhaps. Damian Kingston was a man used to control, yet something about this woman made him feel slightly unmoored. Neither of them realized that the deal they had struck wasn't just a contract. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they believed about love, trust, and themselves. The Kingston estate was more than a home. It was an empire encapsulated in stone and glass. As Emily's modest cab rolled up to the sprawling driveway, her breath caught in her throat. The mansion before her looked like something out of a fairy tale or a billionaire's dream. Its towering pillars, floor-to-ceiling windows, and sprawling gardens painted a picture of wealth that was almost incomprehensible. She clutched the worn strap of her thrifted bag, feeling like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. A butler, immaculately dressed, opened the cab door. "Miss Dawson, welcome. Mr. Kingston is expecting you." Emily stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the polished stone. She glanced around, feeling small and out of place amidst the grandeur. The estate's front doors, massive and intricately carved, swung open to reveal Damien Kingston himself, standing in the grand foyer. "Miss Dawson," he greeted, his voice cool and measured. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the powerful tycoon she'd read about. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, studied her with a hint of curiosity. "Come in." The interior of the mansion was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, marble floors gleamed below, and artwork worth more than her entire yearly salary adorned the walls. Emily felt a pang of discomfort, but she straightened her shoulders. She had agreed to this, and she would face it with dignity. "This will be your home for the next 3 years," Damien said, his tone businesslike. "I'll have someone show you to your quarters." "My quarters?" Emily asked, unable to keep the incredulity out of her voice. Damien raised an eyebrow. "Did you think we'd be sharing a room?" The question hung in the air, making Emily's cheeks flush. "No, of course not," she stammered, feeling foolish. "I just didn't expect, well, quarters." Damien smirked slightly, an expression that softened the sharp angles of his face. "You'll find that life here is full of things you don't expect, Miss Dawson." A housekeeper named Clara arrived to escort Emily to her room. As they walked through the labyrinth of hallways, Clara tried to put Emily at ease. "Don't let the size of the place intimidate you," she said warmly. "It takes time to adjust." Adjusting, however, seemed like an impossible task. Emily's room, or rather, suite, was larger than her entire apartment. The 4-poster bed was draped in silk, and the sitting area featured plush furniture arranged around a fireplace. Through the French doors, a private balcony offered a view of the sprawling gardens. Emily set her bag down gingerly, afraid to disturb the pristine surroundings. Clara gave her a reassuring smile before leaving, and Emily sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed. This was her new life, at least for the next 3 years. She had entered into a contract marriage with a man she barely knew, trading her simple existence for one of unimaginable luxury. Later that evening, a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Damien stood there, his expression unreadable. "Dinner is at 7, he said. "I'll expect you to join me." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of apprehension and determination. She had to find her footing in this unfamiliar world. At 7 sharp, she descended the grand staircase, her simple black dress a far cry from the opulence of her surroundings. Damien was waiting in the dining room, seated at the head of a long table that could easily accommodate 20 people. Tonight, however, it was set for 2. "You're punctual," Damien remarked as she took her seat. "You said 7, Emily replied simply. Their meal was a delicate dance of silence and small talk. Damien asked about her background, her family, and her interests, and Emily answered cautiously, aware that this was more an assessment than a casual conversation. Still, she noticed fleeting moments of genuine curiosity in his gaze, as though he were trying to understand what had brought her into his world. After dinner, Damien walked her to the foot of the staircase. "You'll find that my life is highly structured," he said. "This arrangement requires us to present a united front to the public, but within these walls, you're free to do as you please." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't just a contract, it was a test of her ability to navigate a life that was worlds apart from her own. Days turned into weeks, and Emily gradually became accustomed to the rhythms of life in the Kingston estate. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons reading in the library, and her evenings enduring meticulously planned social events where she played the role of Damien's dutiful wife. At first, the stares and whispers of his social circle unnerved her, but she quickly learned to hold her head high. She might not belong in their world, but she wouldn't let them see her falter. Damien, for his part, was an enigma. He maintained a careful distance, treating her with a detached politeness that bordered on indifference. Yet, Emily couldn't ignore the moments when his guard slipped, the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, or the faint smile that played on his lips when she made a witty remark. There was a complexity to him, a depth that hinted at something more than the ruthless businessman the world saw. One evening, as they shared a rare moment of quiet in the library, Damien surprised her by asking, "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" Emily asked, looking up from her book. "Agreeing to this," he said, gesturing vaguely around them. "Being here." Emily considered his question carefully. "I don't regret helping my family," she said finally. "And I don't regret meeting you." Damien's expression softened, and for the first time, Emily saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "You're an unusual woman, Miss Dawson." "Emily," she corrected him. "You can call me Emily." Damien nodded slowly, as though trying out her name in his mind. Emily. In that moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, and Emily realized that beneath Damien's icy exterior lay a man who was just as lost as she was. Unbeknownst to both of them, their carefully constructed arrangement was beginning to unravel. What had started as a business deal was slowly becoming something neither of them had anticipated, a connection that defied logic and a longing they couldn't ignore. Living within the walls of Damien Kingston's estate was like stepping into an alternate reality, a world where time seemed to move differently. Emily had imagined that her days would feel like a vacation in a five-star resort, but the reality was far from glamorous. The grandeur of the mansion often felt stifling, and the loneliness of its endless hallways made her small studio apartment seem like a haven of warmth by comparison. Emily quickly learned the rules of the house. Damien's household ran like a well-oiled machine, with schedules adhered to with military precision. Meals were served promptly, the staff moved with quiet efficiency, and every corner of the estate was kept immaculately clean. It was a life meticulously curated, and Emily felt like an outsider trying to find her place in a symphony where everyone else already knew the melody. Damien himself was a puzzle she couldn't solve. While he was always courteous, there was a certain formality to his demeanor that created a barrier between them. Even during the moments they spent together, whether it was at the dinner table or attending high-profile events as a couple, there was an emotional distance that kept her from truly understanding him. One evening, as Emily wandered through the library, she found herself drawn to a small corner filled with old journals and ledgers. The handwriting inside was neat and methodical, documenting the history of the Kingston family's business empire. As she leafed through the pages, she felt a strange sense of connection to the stories of struggle and triumph. It made her wonder about Damien. What sacrifices had he made to uphold the family legacy? What burdens did he carry that made him so guarded? Her musings were interrupted by Damien himself, who entered the room with his usual quiet confidence. He noticed the journal in her hands and raised an eyebrow. "Delving into the family archives, are we?" Emily closed the book quickly, feeling like she'd been caught snooping. "I was just curious," she admitted. "It's fascinating to see how your family built everything from the ground up." Damien gave a slight smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fascinating, perhaps, but it comes at a cost." "And what's the cost for you?" she asked softly, surprising even herself with the boldness of the question. For a moment, Damien's expression flickered, revealing something raw and unguarded. "Everything." The weight of his answer lingered in the air, and Emily felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She realized that while Damien lived in luxury, his life was far from enviable. His wealth had come at the expense of his freedom, his privacy, and perhaps even his happiness. As the weeks turned into months, Emily began to carve out her own space within the mansion. She found solace in the garden, where she could lose herself in the vibrant colors of blooming flowers and the soothing sound of the fountain. Gardening had never been a hobby of hers before, but now it became a sanctuary, a place where she could be herself, away from the prying eyes of Damien's world. One morning she was pruning roses when Damien approached, dressed casually for once in a simple white shirt and dark jeans. He looked so different from the sharp-suited businessman she was used to seeing that she almost didn't recognize him. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," he remarked, his tone more conversational than usual. Emily straightened, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "It's peaceful. Besides, I needed a hobby." Damien studied her for a moment, then surprised her by kneeling beside her and picking up a pair of gardening shears. "Show me how it's done." She couldn't help but laugh. "You want to learn gardening?" "Why not?" he replied with a shrug. "I've mastered everything else." For the next hour, they worked side by side, and for the first time, Emily saw a more relaxed side of Damien. He asked her about her favorite flowers, her childhood memories, and her dreams for the future. It was a side of him she hadn't expected, a man who, beneath his stoic exterior, was genuinely curious about the world and the people around him. As they worked, Emily felt the tension between them start to ease. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was a step towards something she couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the beginnings of a friendship, or maybe it was something more. Despite the small moments of connection, the shadow of their contract loomed over them. Damien had been clear from the beginning. This was a marriage of convenience, nothing more. He expected her to play her role as his wife in public, but beyond that, their lives were to remain separate. Emily tried to keep her emotions in check, reminding herself that this was a business arrangement, but it wasn't easy, especially when she began to notice the small things about Damien that made her heart ache in unexpected ways. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was deep in thought, the rare but genuine laugh that escaped him when something amused him, the way his eyes softened when he talked about his late mother. One night, as they prepared for a charity gala, Damien handed her a diamond necklace to wear with her evening gown. The gesture was simple, but the way he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin, sent a shiver down her spine. "You look perfect," he said quietly, his voice almost tender. Emily's heart fluttered, but she quickly reminded herself of the boundaries between them. "Thank you," she replied, her tone as composed as she could manage. At the gala, they played their roles flawlessly, posing for photographs and mingling with guests. But beneath the surface, Emily felt the strain of pretending to be something she wasn't. She wondered if Damien felt it too, or if he was so accustomed to this life that it didn't faze him. When they returned home that night, Damien surprised her by asking, "Do you ever feel trapped?" Emily blinked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I try to focus on the good things." "What good things?" he asked, genuinely curious. Emily hesitated, then smiled faintly. "The little moments, like gardening or seeing the stars at night or talking to you." Damien's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, Emily thought she saw something in his gaze. A longing, perhaps, or a glimmer of something he wasn't ready to admit. But just as quickly he looked away, retreating behind the wall he'd built around himself. "Good night, Emily," he said, his voice back to its usual coolness. "Good night, Damien," she replied, watching him walk away and wondering if she would ever truly understand the man behind the mask. Though Damien remained guarded, Emily couldn't deny that their relationship was changing. The moments they shared, whether it was gardening, discussing books, or simply sitting in companionable silence, were becoming less about obligation and more about genuine connection. But with every step closer they took, Emily felt the weight of her own insecurities. She couldn't forget the terms of their marriage or the fact that she was an outsider in his world, and she couldn't ignore the feelings that were beginning to bloom in her heart, feelings she knew she couldn't afford to have. Little did she know, Damien was grappling with his own emotions. The more time he spent with her, the more he found himself drawn to her kindness, her strength, and her unassuming charm. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known, and for the first time in years he began to question the life he'd built, a life of power, control, and calculated decisions. In Emily, he saw a glimpse of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But Damien Kingston was a man who didn't believe in hope, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to let himself fall. Not yet. The subtle shifts in their relationship were becoming harder to ignore. Damien Kingston, a man known for his unyielding composure and calculated demeanor, was starting to show cracks in his armor. To Emily, it was both fascinating and unsettling. She hadn't expected to see glimpses of vulnerability in him, glimpses that made her wonder what lay beneath the polished surface he presented to the world. One evening, Damien returned home earlier than usual, his tie loosened and his expression uncharacteristically tired. Emily, who had been sketching in the garden, noticed him lingering by the fountain. It was unusual for him to spend time outdoors without purpose, and her curiosity got the better of her. "Rough day?" she asked, approaching him cautiously. Damien looked up, his gaze softening when he saw her. You could say that. She took a seat on the edge of the fountain, watching the water ripple under the fading sunlight. Want to talk about it? For a moment, Damien hesitated, as if weighing the risks of opening up. Then, to her surprise, he sat beside her, letting out a long sigh. Do you ever feel like no matter how much you achieve, it's never enough? Emily tilted her head, considering his words. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. But isn't that what makes life interesting? The idea that there's always something more to strive for? Maybe, he said, his voice tinged with doubt. But sometimes it feels like a race you can't win, like you're chasing something that doesn't even exist. Emily studied him, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of his jacket. It struck her then how lonely he must be, surrounded by wealth and power, but burdened by the expectations that came with them. I think, she said gently, you need to stop running for a while. Just be still. Let yourself breathe. Damien turned to her, his expression unreadable. And what would I do with myself if I stopped? You'd figure it out, she replied with a small smile. Maybe you'd even like it. For a moment, their eyes met, and Emily felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. There was an intimacy in that gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing connection between them. But just as quickly, Damien looked away, retreating behind his familiar walls. The days that followed were marked by subtle changes. Damien began spending more time at home, often joining Emily in the garden or the library. Their conversations, once perfunctory and formal, became more relaxed, even playful at times. Emily found herself looking forward to these moments, savoring the rare glimpses of the man behind the mask. One afternoon, as they walked through the estate's art gallery, Damien paused in front of a painting of a young woman seated by a lake. The brushstrokes were delicate, almost ethereal, and the subject's expression was one of quiet introspection. This was my mother's favorite, Damien said, his voice soft. She used to tell me it reminded her of herself when she was young. Emily glanced at him, surprised by the wistfulness in his tone. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was, he replied, his gaze fixed on the painting. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. No matter how busy she was, she always made time for me. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken emotion. Emily hesitated, then asked, Do you miss her? Every day, Damien admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She was the only person who ever truly understood me. Emily felt a pang of sadness for him. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like to lose someone so important, to carry that grief while navigating the pressures of a world that demanded so much. You don't have to go through it alone, you know, she said gently. There are people who care about you, Damien, people who want to be there for you. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to determine whether she meant it. Sometimes I wonder if that's true, or if it's just wishful thinking. It's